Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Evan Davis. I'm a BBC presenter. It's my pleasure to moderate our discussions for the next 50 minutes. Vibrancy and disruption, a global economy pulling in different directions is our topic. I'm carrying this thing, Consensus Forecast. It's a really good publication if you want to know what current thinking is on the world economy. They just take all the forecasts, add them together and divide by the number they are, and tell you what the average forecast is. And I can tell you that for the US next year, 2.5% growth. For the Eurozone, 2% growth. For the UK, 1.5% growth, a bit embarrassing. Asia Pacific, 4.5% to 5% growth. Eastern Europe, 3%. These figures are not spectacularly great, but these are also figures that show, you know, the global economy on a reasonably good trajectory. And yet, that's the vibrancy bit, and yet there's some disruption in the global economy too. You've had a session on geopolitics. Well, maybe geopolitics is a threat hanging over the world at the moment. There's a particular threat of trade war, which economists view with complete horror. There are financial hangovers. No one quite knows where the Eurozone is going to go, the way the reform ideas of the French for the Eurozone will take it, where the Italian populist government will push the Eurozone, so we've got plenty of issues there. Is the financial system robust? Does the world know how to absorb the technology that is about to sweep upon it? And I think perhaps a kind of meta problem that hangs over all discussions of the world economy at the moment, a really interesting way of framing it, is the challenge of recoupling economic growth with a sense of well-being for the whole populations, particularly the poorer populations of richer countries. Now, these are the sections of the world who've grown increasingly dissatisfied over the last 2 decades. Perhaps the section who've seen their expectations least satisfied, and who, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, have a kind of political muscle in the world economy that means whatever grand ambitions the Davos class or the people in this room, the Davos elite, whatever ambitions you have for global cooperation, they have electoral power that can really muck up your vision. And one way of looking at what's going on in the world is, if you don't look after the poorer people in richer countries, they will make sure your visions of how the world should go will be blocked and obstructed. So how do you shape a world economy that recouples their interest with that of the rest of the world, because they have a huge political power, as we're now seeing in the United States? Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel. Now, I think we have lost Professor Amartya Sen. He may show up, no fault of his own, a problem at the hotel, but we do have Amartya Sen. Well, he needs no introduction at all. I'm very pleased. Professor Sen, if you'd like to take the seat at the end here, we're really glad to have you. Yeah. We'll let you catch your breath and take your seat while I introduce the others. Nearest to me is Ambassador Sue Gay, Chairman of the National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation. Next to Ambassador Sue is Deanne Julius, former chairman actually of Chatham House, senior advisor here still, and chair of the council at University College London, an economist formerly on the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK. And with perhaps a business perspective, Douglas Peterson, President and Chief Executive Officer of S&P Global, has both a perspective of business and, of course, his company has a perspective on where the world is going. It's a company that has commentates on what's happening in the world. We'll get both those perspectives. Professor Sen, we're very pleased to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. What I'm going to do is I am going to ask each panelist to answer 2 questions. First question is, what is keeping them awake at the moment? What is the problem that they would think and they would highlight as the biggest problem? After they've each done that, I'll ask them what one idea they have, what one prescription they have. I'm asking these 2 questions merely to get the conversation going, because there is so much, frankly, that we could talk about. So I'm going to start, Professor Sen, I will let you gather your thoughts, so I'll come to you last. But yeah, I'm going to ask Doug first. Doug, if you would just set out, perhaps from the business perspective, what is the sort of number one problem? Just sort of, you know, not too long, just a minute on the problem. We'll go down the line, we'll get Professor Sen's problem, and then we'll get each of your solutions.
Great.
Doug.
Thank you for having me here today. Well, first of all, we're in a very positive economic environment, as you pointed out, with synchronous growth around the world. And we've talked earlier in the earlier panel about trade, about technology. I think there's more to come. But let me focus in on the financial markets and the financial sector. Recessions have a very, very negative impact on economies. They slow down growth, they dislocate people, as well as, in many cases, as we see in the last one, which is a very deep recession, they have political as well as financial costs to populations. We've come out of that with the help of central banks by having quantitative easing and increasing the size of their balance sheets around the world. And so why do I raise that? All of that positive news is something that's potentially negative or keeps me up at night. We're now going into a period where central banks are going to have to start unwinding all of that liquidity they pumped into the markets. In Japan, we've seen more than a lost decade. We're now into 2 lost decades. Europe is now in a lost decade. The United States has started to come out of its lost decade with strong growth. But I look at the situation of the global balance sheets of financial institutions are strong, central banks are strong, but as you start unwinding that, it's something that worries me. Are there people that understand credit? Are there people who understand credit risk? Do we have the right approach to managing liquidity in the financial sector? And will there be any sort of new shocks or contagions that come out of the great unwind and the potential shocks that we have to the economic markets?
That's a very, very good starting point. And then there are a lot of people working in the City of London who have not lived through a complete cycle, and we have no idea, or they have no idea, what that means or what is going to hit them. Deanne, what would you cite as a kind of the big challenge at the moment?
Well, despite the fact that I'm basically an economist, for me, what keeps me awake at night is populism. I think that many of the issues that we have, many of the reasons that populist movements, which is a movement, it's not a philosophy, but it is a movement which challenges the status quo, challenges the political institutions that have underpinned our economy, challenges globalization. And of course, it itself has grown partly out of the inequalities that the growth that we have had have fostered. There's no easy solution to those inequalities, and I think that, for me at least, it is that combination of the politics of populism, which is brought into positions of authority in many countries, not just the United States, people who themselves are not focused predominantly on economic growth, but are focused on issues of America first or China first, or indeed, even in the case of the Soviet Union and others, focused on their own political standing in the world, which can spill over into a very dangerous dynamic of trade wars and other
trade wars being the most obvious manifestation of a kind of economic effect. Deanne, just before I move to Ambassador Su, do you think this audience should recognize they have some responsibility for populism emerging in the world? Or do you think populism is like a kind of an exogenous shock that just kind of struck out of nowhere?
Well,
no, let me get Deanne first, and then I'll get your...
okay.
I fear it's a combination. I think that it did have many important roots in the global financial crisis. Because that was something which shook, not predominantly probably people in this room, but shook a lot of others in terms of the unemployment that resulted, the difficulty with the banking systems and so forth. So part of it, I think, was it was a shock. We're 10 years after that shock, but I think many economists thought even at the beginning it might take 10 years from a true global financial crisis, not just an economic crisis. And I think then it is a matter of, I think someone said this morning, a matter of rage. You know, it is the feeling something's gone seriously wrong, and the leaders that we had in our countries, the political parties that we voted for, didn't have the answer. They didn't protect people from what went wrong.
And it's amazing how synchronous it is around the world, from Brexit to Italy to Austria to Eastern Central Europe, United States. It's very striking. Ambassador Su, what's the thing and we've got a very global panel here, a lot of different perspectives. I'm really interested in how you see the biggest problem.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, a heartfelt thanks go to the Chatham House for organizing this timely conference about this very important question concerning us all. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing a linkage of this very important global question with all those who are participating in this. I think if we count each and every one of, I wouldn't say of you, of us who are part of this process, I would say we are all participants and we all benefited from and we all make contribution to a very important global trend. That's globalization. For instance, some of us are professors, some are editors, some are photographers. We do not have to go to the rice fields and work because we have this division of labor. Globalization is a process which provides a platform, a general market, so that we can, in this framework, and we can have a better allocation of resources, so that the human world now has what we have today. I think that being said, later, if needed, I'll elaborate some of my points. I think now, when we look at the world, we can see that there is a challenge to this global trend of globalization. Just now, I agree with Madame that there is a populism and also trade protectionism, and which formed a kind of a trend called anti-globalization. So I think, of course, for this quandary, this difficult question, it's hard to find a panacea, find a medicine that would cure all these problems. But I think the international communities and think tanks and tankers need to sit together to determine what would be the right path ahead. Of course, there will be roads, no bright future, but there will be lots of hurdles lying ahead. We need to stay together just to make joint efforts to strive in the direction which has been making us better and which will be making our life better still in tomorrow. Thank you.
But I just want Ambassador to push you, because do you think that what went wrong and the threat to globalization, which Deanne and you have both highlighted, do you recognize that that might have a legitimate public concern? They say, we don't see the benefit of this thing you've been telling us is good for us. You know, you're telling us to eat our vegetables, and they're making us sick. and so, you know, I worry we're going to sort of have a conversation in a kind of echo chamber in which everyone's going to say globalization is good and not have heard a message that for sort of big towns, small cities, Rust Belt, US, in Bradford, Barnsley, Burnley, Blackburn, Bury, all these places in the UK, this globalization does not feel, has not felt like something that needs to be defended.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, for this audience, I don't think I need to bring out elaborate like a theories. Let me just use this as an example. Somebody is going to say that they are going to raise taxes against all products made in China, 25% of taxes. Well, it's not going to hurt China alone. It's going to hurt Americans, buyers, households, Christmas presents, so you can pay 25% more. Let me just say the aluminum foil for making this cell phone. You can see that in the Apple. These former Chinese ambassadors using the Apple because we are now in a globalized world. I just happened to be an ambassador in Iceland and earlier in the Caribbean state of, in the name of Suriname. By the way, when I presented my credentials to the president of Iceland, he asked why. From a tropical island tropical place now, you have ambassador to Iceland. I said global warming. We are not in the globalized world. Then after my two ambassadorship, I noticed that, wow, a bauxite produced in Suriname, that is a country next to Guyana, French Guyana, and then shipped, and locally, they turned to alumina, a kind of, they call it white powder. They shipped all the way to Iceland for the smelters. Because Iceland, they have the cheapest electricity.
They have the
How cheap?
renewable, yeah.
Yeah, only 2 US cents. That's 1/3 of the Chinese electricity. That's why, and that the product aluminum is produced in Europe and other products. So if you are going to have taxes, I'm sure that we are not alone.
Okay. I want to get Professor Sen to comment on how you would describe the big challenge or the biggest problem at the moment in the world economy.
Big challenge of?
For the world economy.
Oh, the world economy, just the world economy, yeah. Well, I think the big challenge of the world economy is to appreciate how globalization can be valued and extended in every sphere. What we have had, and that's to the credit of the world, that is to develop globalization of trade, which has happened to a great extent. There have been globalization of financial transactions. I think, and I'll come back to what has not happened, but before that, I think we overestimate that, and I was reading the write-up for this session. I couldn't fully understand what vibrancy means. Vibrancy, I tend to think to be a good thing. You tell a student, vibrant guy, he will be happy, rather than a source of challenge, source of problem. I don't think that the world economy was in a particularly bad shape. I think there were a number of things that happened recently, of which Brexit is certainly one. The American attempt at suddenly deciding that it should get value for money and not allow other countries to have advantages which it did not have, and suddenly impose that. Then this immigration channel, which is going to become bigger and bigger, I think. All these have tended to sway things in a rather depressing way. But generally, the world economy, as far as the overall trade picture is concerned, seems to be going in the right direction. It happened, we mentioned 2 lost decades in Japan. I think you mentioned that. But actually, Japan, to a great extent, has mended that, moved away from the utterly unproductive phase of trying to fill everything down. Europe has pulled out of austerity, which I think was a disastrous policy to follow. Right. So these are, in general, we were in good shape, excepting that we have had some hard knocks coming from political side of the picture. Okay. Yeah. But I want to say the other, because that's the more important.
I just want to, I'm going to pause you there, hold that thought, because I think we can just adjust your microphone a bit, and then
Pardon?
You're just going to adjust your microphone a bit.
The microphone,
just a tiny
okay.
bit. It's a bit noisy. I think it's catching your breath. So we're just going to. They're kind of particularly annoying, these microphones, but they're also actually very good when they work. Yeah. So.
Repeat what I had said.
No, don't. We got it. We just need you to. Okay. Now carry on. Finish your point.
Yeah. But so on that trade front, I'm worried, but I'm worried over the political barriers that have been imposed. I don't think the global economy was doing badly at all in terms of the trade relation is concerned. Where it was doing very badly is not taking the big lesson that actually the east of Asia offered, beginning with Japan, from the time of Meiji Restoration, and then South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and China, increasingly. Namely, you have to extend education for all. You have to extend healthcare for all. This actually, if you look at the statement in 1871, shortly after the Meiji Restoration, what they mentioned is that the way to economic development for us would be to educate everyone. This is a lesson, my country, India, has not learned. Now, it's still going very fast. It may well be among the top 2 or 3 fastest growing economy. But being poor in India is not like being poor in China. Namely, you don't know where to go if there's a healthcare hazard. You don't know where to go if you seek education for your school child, and there is no school in sight. Now, I think if you really judge the success of the world economy, and you ask me to comment on the world economy, no less. So I think that is, I mean, India is an extreme case. Pakistan is perhaps even more extreme in some ways. Bangladesh done a little better in some ways. But I think talking about globalization without regarding the thing that moved European Enlightenment, namely education for all, healthcare for all, not to talk about that is an enormous gap. And I think that's where I think we have to address things rather than stabilize the trade and so on.
Okay, so you've actually answered both the questions because you've answered the problem and you've given a solution, which is good. Let me just get the other 3 very briefly, because I do want to open up. Which area should we focus on? And usually when you ask that, people give you an objective of, you know, we should be richer, we should be, you know, nicer, or something like that. What would be the kind of policy lever you would focus on? Doug, why don't you go first here?
And let me reflect a little bit on some of the comments. Yeah. So we hear about education and social welfare programs. We heard about populism. I agree that those are issues in the social welfare and education in the United States and many other developed economies. We don't have currently systems that are sustainable. And we're going to have to address those, and those are long-term requirements. And politicians' life cycles are too short to think about those very long-term issues, so we need to go after those. When I made my comments earlier, I talked about the financial systems, and we have a pretty well-oiled machine when it comes to the FSB, the BOE, the Fed, the Japanese Central Bank, the PBOC, et cetera. We need to keep up that and keep that network going, ensure that the financial system is sound, that the private sector has adequate capital. But my solution that I'd like to recommend goes back to trade, which has come up over and over this morning. Trade has been one of the sources of job changing in developed countries, as many jobs have been outsourced, as well as the trade economy has changed. One of the areas I believe we need to take a step back and is look at what is working, what is not working in global trade. There are many things that are not working in global trade. Unfortunately, I believe the TPP was a very solid trade agreement that was starting to address some of the things that are not working. And when I talk about things that are not working, it's not just goods. One of the mistakes that the US administration is making right now is they're claiming that everything to trade has to do with steel and aluminum and iPhones. It goes way beyond that, and some of the best stories of trade are tourism and financial services and medical devices and pharmaceuticals that are services that go beyond the traditional classic definition of trade, which is just goods. I believe that the trade system globally needs to become more sophisticated, move out of the 1950s framework that it has. We need to start also considering data, intellectual property, technology, because last comment, if we're worried about populism now because of the displacement from trade, technology is coming with a lot of displacement. There are going to be hundreds of millions of jobs which are going to change because of technology. I don't believe that jobs are going to go away, but jobs are going to change. If you go back 50, 80, 100 years ago, we had 50, 40% of our populations were in agriculture. Today in the United States, it's less than 3%. But right now we're at a 4%, under 4% unemployment level. So how did we go from a 50% agricultural economy to a 3% agricultural economy and have this massive transition of all kinds of new jobs? And we're confronting that now. And to your point about education, our education systems need to reflect what are going to become the jobs of the future.
Actually,
so
that's one of the services that you
trade and jobs of the future are, I think, very critical things that we have to serve.
And trade and services requires much more thought.
Trade of services.
Much more about regulation than tariffs and borders.
Exactly.
And yeah.
Protection, intellectual property.
Good one. Ambassador Su.
Yeah. This is a very difficult question. You cannot solve it with a simple answer. So I would say that at least there will be 4 elements needed. And the first and foremost, we need a peaceful environment. That's a must for economic development. Because, for instance, in our neighbors, we are now working on the problems of North Korea, Korean Peninsula. And that being said, let me say that development, we need to keep all our efforts on development, because development is the general key to solve almost all of the problems of international communities. And thirdly, for how to achieve those ends, because peace and development are like 2 halves of the same walnut. We need to have cooperation, international community, and we need to put, above all of us, the interests of the international community. Now, each nation, of course, has its own national interests. However, we need to find a common denominator. The last, and certainly not the least, is we need to think not only of your benefits, your problems, and think of benefits for others. So we need to have inclusive approach. We have win-win results. Thank you.
Okay, so they're sort of mostly relating on kind of global governance and the global system. Right, Deanne, your recommendations.
Well, I cannot disagree with what others have said, but I am much more pessimistic. I don't think this is a moment to focus on the big issue, on how global governance can be improved, because actually I think we are in a declining period right now. And the last month has been a real shock to me, at least, of everything that's gone wrong. The G7 breaking up without even a communique agreeing on very bland generalities, the trade war that has started with the tariffs that have come in on steel and aluminum. Steel prices have shot up 40% since then. The Chinese, I think rightly, saying, well, if you're putting 50 million on us, we're going to hit back with 50 million. Now we're talking about 200 billion. And you know, we are in a downward spiral, in my view, right now. And economics being what it is, we won't see the impact tomorrow. You know, we will see the impact over the next 6 to 12 months, maybe even longer than that. So I think we are in a situation where what we need to do is partly what others have said, Ambassador Su and so forth, to extol some of the benefits of globalization, but I think actually we're in damage limitation mode.
Right.
And what we need to do is to point out the very specific, anecdotal downsides of what's going on. And in the financial markets, for example, just to take one example that I think most people don't realize how damaging it can be to deny access to SWIFT, the payments system that enables countries to change currencies easily. This is what got ZTE in real trouble, nearly a death sentence, as it's been called. And the problem where the political leaders are using economic tools like SWIFT, which most people haven't even heard of, probably outside this room at least, in very damaging ways, leading to retaliation, I think puts us into an extremely difficult period for the immediate future. So I would say this is no solution, I'm afraid.
That wasn't a solution. But you did say something really interesting, and I just want to push you on it. You said China is right to retaliate. Because there is one argument that you could say, which is escalation is going to make this worse. Now, you can see the dilemma that if you don't escalate, you encourage the populists to do things that you don't like. But if you escalate, you encourage the populists to do the thing you don't like. And your trade suffers because you put tariffs on stuff that you might want to buy.
Yeah, I think that's right, but we have to remember who we're dealing with here. And I think when you're dealing with a bully, you have to stand up. Right. And that's the situation we're in. And I think this is not only a situation of China, US, if you look at the auto threats on auto imports, you know, which are going to hurt Japan,
so you say the same for
Germany.
The Europeans. Basically, the Europeans need to do the same. Pick proportionate tariffs.
And Canada. I'm afraid, you know, it's one of those things where we do have to stand up in the short term in hopes that we eliminate longer term problems.
Can I just ask, I just want to ask the room whether you agree with the proposition, if you're faced with a bully, and we know who Deanne is talking about, you should retaliate and stand up to the bully. How many of you think that is the right approach in trade terms at the moment in the world? And how many of you think that is the wrong approach for, say, the Europeans and the Chinese? Overwhelmingly, you think it's the positive. But actually, I saw a lot of hands didn't go up at all because you... Right. We're going to take questions now. We've had a good starting discussion. We've used up more time than I intended on that. Questions, remember, I can get some on Slido here, but we'll start with the lady here, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the back there. We'll start, Do say who you are, because it's useful for us to know who you are.
Hi, Bernice Lee from the Hoffman Center at Chatham House. I think it's very hard to disagree with Professor Sen that, of course, responding to the problems of globalization involve investing in some of the structural fundamentals. At the same time, as Doug said, if we're seeing more changes on the horizon, then education is probably no longer going to be a one-off but a lifelong pursuit. So my question really is, if that's the case, that all of us, even Gen X like me, have to retrain and learn code at some point, do you think anyone is actually prepared for it? Any governments? What are we going to do about healthcare if we can't tie, for example, our health benefits to our jobs? So I just want to know who you think is best prepared and whether or not governments and businesses are both doing enough. And I just want to be clear that people talking about employability rather than employment is not just governments. It's also companies like Walmart and others.
Okay. I'm going to hold that thought, panel, because I'm going to take a couple at a time. Yes, the gentleman over at the back there. Yeah. So...
Al-Hamazi, Oxford and SOAS. To follow on from the point on tech disruptors, algorithmic bias this morning, and also a question I put to Slider earlier, I'd be very keen to hear from Professor Sen or other panelists. Where is the fourth industrial revolution taking us in terms of the implications for the developing world vis-a-vis unemployment and broadening inequality? And maybe one can think about how we reconcile your capabilities approach with AI, automation, and the like, and where we're going vis-a-vis ownership of tech and so on. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. Let's take those questions. Professor Sen, do you want to take both those? So are governments fit and ready to deliver the education and healthcare?
Yeah. I have to confess, it must be in my old age. I didn't actually follow the question that was there. Can you summarize it for me?
I think it was recognizing the need for what you say, more education. Where are governments ready to deliver that and to take on that agenda in a constructive way?
Why our governments don't do it? Is that the...
Well, I suppose it did. It's why that isn't happening, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways the rhetoric of development has been entirely misleading in the way it has proceeded. The dominant dialogue has been about economic growth and success of a kind in which education and health and so on don't actually figure very well. Now, it misses out two things. One, that in itself, education and health makes life worth living. And this is not a new point. Adam Smith, 1776, was talking about that. But the other point that Adam Smith made is that nothing increases the productivity of individuals as much as better quality education, better quality living condition and healthcare. Now, what has happened, it's easy for me to criticize my country since no one could say that you're criticizing others. If we look at India, and the present government, of course, is particularly deficient in that, but previous governments too. There was a way of counting success, which is in terms of overall GDP growth. On the other hand, if you look at the distribution, there are peculiar things. For example, civil servants pay, the middle bureaucracies pay have gone up dramatically. Agricultural wages today is no higher than it was 30 years ago. Now, that is not economic progress in some ways, because a vast number of people are there. Now, when some of these agricultural laborers, agricultural peasants get upset because they can't pay back loans and kill themselves, and there's a lot of self-immolation going on, then the newspapers take an interest. It becomes a newsworthy story. But it's not a newsworthy story that agricultural wages are stagnant. It's not a newsworthy story that agriculturists are having a quality of life which had not improved over 30, 40 years. Now, I think the media is very important in that. India is happy to be a democracy. It has some advantage, some disadvantage. The main advantage is that it gives us potentially the opportunity to push the government to move. But for that you need organization, you need to do things that draw attention. It's happened to some extent. Gender has become much more noticeable in India than it used to be at an earlier stage. At a still earlier stage, untouchability became a big issue. But there are many issues that don't get any attention, and not even from the media, not even from the left-wing parties. And I think that needs change. Now, the China's case, China doesn't have, in the sense of India, a democracy. And if something goes wrong, China could hit a real problem, as it did at the time of the Great Leap Forward, when 30 million people minimally died. Now, there is always that danger that when things are going fine, you say, why do you want to change anything? But when things go wrong, democracy has a corrective which other systems don't have. But the advantage on the other side is that there was a time, for example, after the economic reforms in China. If you look at the period, from the beginning of the Chinese communist regime, they had importance of education, healthcare, you could say, both in an Eastern way, as well as Mao Zedong's interest in that subject. I mean, China, for example, compared with Russia, has always had a much greater role of education.
Right.
People overlook the fact that the first leader of the Soviet Communist Party who went to a university was Gorbachev after Lenin. Nobody in between.
Amazing fact, isn't it?
China has not been the case. Always there have been an educational concern. And that's really what's going on, and healthcare too, at a primitive level. 79 when they had reform, and they made the economy go brilliantly well. On the other hand, they took away the healthcare for all at the same time. And it took them a long time, for 25 years, 79 to 2004. China had the fastest growth rate in the world, but its life expectancy was almost stagnant compared with least and progress earlier. But then when they decided they made a mistake, it required about 5 or 6 people to recognize they made a mistake. And then, phew, it was changed.
It got much better.
In India, you would have to move a political party and organize it. That's not against democracy, but that's the way democracy works. So we have to look at the democratic system and the economic system together. I think the other question that came, I mean, I thought
just
maybe
briefly,
it was,
Professor. Yeah.
Sorry? I think it was mainly an observation, and I agree with what I heard that observation. Was there a particular question that you...
Professor, I mean, it was. I'm going to pass that one on to Doug, because Doug is I think, thought quite hard about the technology. Fourth industrial revolution, Doug. Maybe comment on education.
So I would like to just comment on a couple of the things that came up on what's changing the environment and how we do have to embrace this lifelong learning. Well, first of all, I just have a couple of numbers I want to share with you. It took the radio 38 years to reach 50 million users. Television 13, the internet 4. Twitter took 9 months, and Pokemon Go took 19 days. And the reason I talk about that is the speed of adoption of technology has moved so fast that we have to also move fast. And we're talking about this lifelong learning, and corporations also have a responsibility. We talked about the government's responsibility, but organizations like corporations like ours have a responsibility to ensure that their workforces are prepared. So that means training our own employees, but it also means if you have a corporate responsibility program, that you're also looking into the communities around you, investing in university programs, providing your employees as professors into universities and schools to ensure that the workforce is staying up to speed. And technology and AI are moving so fast that the nature of work is changing, and not just in companies like ours that are data companies, but also in the farms. If you go to farms these days, they're using all new analytics. They're using drones. They're getting information about the water in the soil, the nutrients in the soil, that with all kinds of new sensors. And so every job around us is going to be changing. And so this idea of continuous education and upgrading it is really important.
Right. Quick one from Ambassador Su, and then I want to take another couple, because but quick.
Very quick, 1 minute.
Less than a minute.
Just attend a conference in Afghanistan, and some people said that we need military intervention. Some said you need democracy, village election. And our team said that probably you need some bread. And then somehow you need better schools and provide better education to the children, to the girls, so that eventually people will have hope they will eradicate the bed for terrorism. Thank you.
Okay. Look, yeah, we'll take a couple more questions. We'll take the lady here, and then we will take, I will look over there. We'll take the gentleman on the end over there. Yes.
So, thank you very much. Tricia de Borgra, I'm a writer and artist. On your question that you told the audience, this is why I'm no expert, my answer was I don't know. So forgive me if I sound a bit naive here. But on the big issue, on that thing about being nicer and all of that, GDP is still measuring kind of an erroneous indication of how a country is really doing in terms of, I know, Deanne, you were saying that with populism, we are frightened of it, but populism does have a grain of truth to it, and it's that famous phrase of the country's GDP might be doing very well, but that's not my GDP. And so at a recent OECD conference, they were quite, positive about the economy right now. But the indicators were things that were actually not particularly positive for countries. So, for example, unemployment is the lowest it's ever been since 1980. But what kind of employment does that mean? Some of that employment actually leads to private debt, much more so than without having those jobs. Yep. Or, for example, manufacturing is up, but there's a lot of weaponry being manufactured and being factored in. Things that are bad for the environment are good for the GDP. Is there, with the speed at which everything is happening now, is there a way of building in a social contract into GDP so that countries...
That's a good question. So social contract, recoupling GDP. So that is, for me, I think just the biggest question is how do you recouple GDP to people's actual welfare? We had a question over here.
Thank you, Nick Greenstock. Just to follow on from Trish's point, actually, how do we begin to form some element of compact between those that are benefiting from globalization to those who feel that they have been left out, so that they actually recognize that they are the beneficiaries? And
all in it together.
And also that those who have been left behind recognize what might need to be done to re-engage in that global...
Yeah. It's a very, very similar question. Now, actually, on Slido, someone has actually come up with an issue that I think is a sort of practical thing that does get to some of this. international corporate tax policy is stuck even further back than trade policy, which is stuck in the 50s. Global behemoth companies, huge global companies, take full advantage. How do we fix that? I'm not going to ask you to answer how we fix the tax system, but I'd be interested, Deanne, in whether you think actually fixing the global tax system, so that the tax system is global to match the corporations rather than companies competing to try and attract those companies and thus lowering the effective tax rates of those companies, is one of the answers to the two questions you've had. Another point I'm going to throw in, because Doug in a way made this about companies having responsibility. Has the whole notion of the company exists in the Milton Friedman world, where its only real objective is shareholder value, its employees all work for an agency by which they're self-employed or they're part-time on flexible contracts, has that gone too far? And is the agenda that we've just heard about from these two, does it require a different view of what the company's place in Western society, at least, is? In which a company is a place which has responsibilities, and the workers have responsibilities, rather than the company is a thing that just hires and fires by the day, depending on its latest needs. Deanne, I want you to comment on that and these 2 points, really.
Yeah, I think they're very interesting points. I mean, to take the corporate tax situation first, it is a very important signal. It's something that people can focus on, showing the unfairness of where the wealth ends up. But from an economic point of view, actually corporate taxes are not a very large part of any of our tax revenue. It's less than 10% in this country, and that's true in most countries. So, you know, even if you could fix it in some more equitable way, it would not make a huge contribution to the overall fiscal resources to use for things like health and education. In addition, in theory, you shouldn't be taxing these intermediate products. You should really tax income and land. But leave the theory aside, I think the fact that many corporations have managed to avoid paying almost any sort of tax on very large profits that they make in other countries has been an issue. And
it's not about the money, it's about the principle, and everybody's seeing. They don't want to be told we're all in it together, when some people seem to be doing very well, but they're not.
You know, I think it is a complicated enough situation that the OECD work is the right way to go about it, because there isn't any perfect solution to it. So it's a problem that has been recognized, and there is this body of work on base that's going on. I think, though, the bigger question is this one about a social contract or the role of GDP. Certainly GDP is not anywhere near a perfect measure, but it's a handy measure. I don't think there is a perfect measure of welfare, simply because most of us would weight that differently. But there are interesting measures around. You know, when they publish the happiness index and show that actually it's the Scandinavian countries that usually have the highest happiness score, whether it's short-term happiness of how happy were you yesterday, or the long-term satisfaction of happiness. So one needs to look into those things, I think, to see why is it that some countries, as a social contract, do better than others. And it may be that community values, keeping things somewhat small scale, stability, not changing too fast when technology allows you to change, that some of these values are actually quite important, in addition, of course, to income.
Yeah. Doug, I'm interested in your view on the corporation and the tax, the responsibilities of corporations as feeling like more part of a community and less just a thing for shareholders.
So when you do think about the role of the tax system as well as corporations, let me just take one step back. And the U.S. tax system, which was just recently reformed for corporations, had been designed after World War II, which was an agricultural industrial economy. It was definitely outdated. The provisions of what you taxed, how you taxed it, its global role. So there was a need to make it more competitive, and I do think we can see the fruits of that now in a high growth economy that's kicking in the United States. But the role role of the corporation, corporations do have responsibility beyond just the shareholder. Even though the financial return and the capital it's deployed, the resources are more than just capital. They're people, their technology, their innovation, their intellectual property. And when we talk about the corporations, if I go to organizations like the Business Roundtable, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about developing the workforce of the future. And then within every corporation I know, we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about the environment. In our case of our own company, it's very important for our employees to know that we are offsetting our carbon footprint through programs that we can have with carbon offset companies. And this is important for our employees to know that we have embraced these types of programs to offset that, to ensure that we're investing for a future workforce is very different than maybe what it was in the past. So the employees, our customers, our communities are demanding that we are involved in very important issues that are not just for the shareholder, but also for our communities.
I mean, my observation is I think there's a real sense that we're on an inflection point and the corporations are having to rethink somewhat what their objectives are. Professor Sen, very briefly, how we make GDP a better measure of welfare, or how you connect GDP to welfare, or what you measure instead of GDP. I know just the 1 minute version.
Is an ingredient of our prosperity, and that plays a part in our welfare. But our welfare depends also on how that develops. Now, I'm quoting Adam Smith at one occasion in The Wealth of Nations. He says, why do we want in present-day term will be high GDP? He says, why do we want economy to succeed for a fast economic growth? And he said there are two reasons. One, it increases the individual income of people, allowing them to do what they have reason to want to do. And second, it allows the government to do, the commonwealth, as he put it, to do those things which the government alone can do well. And higher GDP or higher economic growth allows you to do that. But the second doesn't follow automatically. You could have, and it happens, for example, in my country, that you have a very fast rate of economic growth, but the base of education, base of healthcare, etc., have remained very, very primitive indeed. And in the case of China, they have been moved forward and moved not so forward. And the moves forward have produced enormous return. If there's every instrument in my pocket the Chinese can make, it is partly because the education has been such that they can follow quality control, rule of instruction, which without the school education you wouldn't. So I think we have
take
to
this
look
microphone
at,
actually, because they're having problems with your mic.
okay. So without the school education and proper good school education, you won't be able to have that versatility. I mean, if we look at India, what do? We produce pharmaceutical, we produce IT, we produce some obscure reason motor parts very well. But that's it. But in every instrument that you can think of, China can make. What's the difference? The difference basically is education. And that is not unrelated to GDP, because GDP allows you the opportunity to do it. You shouldn't depend it only on that. But if you don't use it, that is a pretty bad black mark.
Spend your GDP wisely, and then GDP is better connected. Okay, I'm so sorry. We really have, actually, we're over time. We're meant to finish. I'm going to take one more question. A good final question, perhaps. Yeah, we'll take the gentleman here in the front row here. And this is going to be a very last one because we are running late. Go ahead. Tell us who you are, of course.
My name is Cha Yuxiao. I'm a traveling scholar and also a student from UCL. I have a question for Ambassador Su and also Professor Sen. That is, 3 years ago, Chinese leadership have launched an ambitious plan of poverty reduction. Under this structure, there is a specific policy have been applied, focusing on education, healthcare, and gender equality. According to the statistic of Chinese government, there will be more than 40 million population will be licked out of the absolute poverty by the year 2020. What do you see the future outcome of this policy, of this goal? And do you think there is any challenge bring by the turbulence of the China-US trade?
Right. To the anti-poverty program. I'm going to just give that one to Ambassador Su, because we are out of time, and so I'm going to give him the last word. And it is a good question to end on, because it takes us right back to the emerging markets and their own
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to answer this question together with the previous one about the GDP. Well, GDP is not the only means to measure a country's progress. For instance, 2012, China's GDP overtook that of Japan. However, GDP per capita, we were only the 87th in the world, so we still have a long way to go. And also, somebody also mentioned education and employment. And that year and this year, each year we have 7 million just new young college graduates. They all need jobs. The second one is that we need a proper new way to measure our economic and social progress, that is index of happiness. I won't go and elaborate. And lastly, to lift people out of poverty. The number is not only 40 million, but 70 million. And that's a thing China is working on. We hope in the end that we will try to narrow the gap between the most rich and the have-nots. Because my one point in today's People's Daily, if you can go to the website, and there is a new article that I've written that has just been published today. It's about globalization and China's open and to the outside and the reforms. So I thought that we need to, some of the countries today, it's not the globalization that needs to draw all the populist or anti-globalization people's blames and criticism. In many of the countries today, it's the distribution system you can find the problems. We need to work together. Thank you very much.
Right, and that's a good point on which to end. I'm just going to note a couple of other Slido questions about the threat to economic development is not just from populists. If you look at Brazil, it comes from the social and economic elite. Another one saying, as we grapple with rage at what went wrong economically, are we on the brink of a crisis in the form of a male backlash in light of the visible focus on advancing women? I mean, the questions, these are these are all really interesting discussions way beyond our payroll here, but I think they show that there's a lot of elements to the issue of populism and its relation to the global economy and the way the rules have been moving. We've only had a chance to really skirt around a few of those issues, but for me what comes out is the huge emphasis on education as a tool for trying to recouple some of the gap between GDP and people's sense of well-being. Now, ladies and gentlemen, lunch is going to be upstairs. You go to the gallery for that. Hurry, because you're getting there late, so don't leave them waiting. But I think we should, before you all go for that, we should thank our panel for a really terrific discussion. Thank you very much. Thanks, Emma.